Hi and welcome to this course. My name is Maximilian Schwarzmuller and I will be your instructor in this course on Flutter and Dart. And in this course, you will learn how to build amazing mobile apps for Android and iOS with Flutter and Dart from the ground up without any prior knowledge assumed. You need no Flutter, no Dart knowledge. You don't even need programming knowledge, though of course it will help. But we're going to start at the very basics and you will learn it all step by step so that by the end of the course, you will be able to build your own Flutter apps. Now in this course, you will learn all the core concepts and features that you must know in order to work with Flutter. In addition, we're also going to dive into many more advanced features, and you're going to learn all these things by building multiple demo apps so that you don't just have the theory, but that instead you learn all these things by applying them to concrete projects and by therefore also building a nice portfolio of demo apps. And therefore I'd say let's not wait any longer, let's dive right in and let's start with the most important question. What exactly is Flutter? So what is Flutter? Flutter is actually a combination of two main parts. For one, it's a UI framework, which is a fancy way of saying that Flutter is a collection of code packages and things you can use in your code to write cross-platform apps, cross-platform user interfaces. Because that's one of the main selling points of Flutter. With Flutter, you can have a single code base and yet generate apps for a broad variety of target platforms. And that's a huge advantage because without a solution like Flutter, you would have to learn different programming languages for different platforms because historically there wasn't a single shared language that could have been used to target all these platforms. So that's one of the main selling points of Flutter, and in this course you will of course learn how to write that Flutter code so that you can target these different platforms. But the code alone and this UI framework, which gives you the things you use in your code to build these good-looking user interfaces, isn't enough. Instead, Flutter also gives you a collection of tools that you use in combination with your code to then actually convert your code to code that is able to run on these different target platforms. Because that code that you write in this single code base does not out of the box work on these different platforms. Instead, it must be translated to machine code that does work on these different platforms. So, for example, some specific machine code that does work on Android or that does work on iOS. And that translation is also done by Flutter. To be precise, it's done by these Flutter tools that are part of the overall Flutter solution, if you want to call it like this. So that you have the things you use in your code, the packages you use in your code to build good-looking user interfaces, and the tools that you need to then turn that single code base into different code packages for these different target platforms. Because Flutter is all about building those multi-platform apps based on that one single code base and programming language so that you don't have to learn multiple programming languages in order to build apps for multiple platforms. With Flutter, it's just one programming language that you have to learn and use. So Flutter is all about being able to build apps for different target platforms off a single code base. However, technically, Flutter itself is not a programming language. You're not learning the Flutter programming language. Instead, Flutter is a framework for building user interfaces with Dart, and Dart is the actual programming language. Now, what's a framework? Well, a framework is simply a collection of packages and utility functions and functionalities, and generally speaking, things that you can use in your code. Like, for example, some pre-built code that you can add to your code to make sure that a button is displayed on the screen. That's what the Flutter framework gives you. Now, as mentioned, Dart is the actual programming language you're learning, and Dart is a language developed by Google, which cannot just be used for building mobile or cross-platform apps with Flutter, but to be fair, Flutter is the main use case for Dart. And you use Flutter on top of Dart, so to say, to build these cross-platform apps. The Flutter tooling that's also part of the overall Flutter solution then will translate that Dart code that uses Flutter features to that machine code for the different target platforms, as mentioned in the previous lecture. But technically, you as a developer are not just learning Flutter, but also Dart. But of course, with this course, you will learn both. You need no prior Dart knowledge. Instead, you will learn how to build mobile apps with Flutter, and along the way, you will also learn Dart, so that by the end of the course, you know both. So by now, you know that Flutter is a thing you can use to write code in a single code base and translate that code to machine code for different target platforms. Now, Flutter, as you can see, offers a broad variety of possible target platforms. For example, you can build mobile apps for iOS and Android. And initially, that was all that was supported by Flutter, and up to this day, I would argue it's still the primary focus of Flutter, or to put it in other words, these platforms are best supported by Flutter, and it is the focus of this course. It always has been, and with this course, you will learn how to build mobile apps with Flutter. Now, what you will learn in this course will still help you for these other target platforms, but those won't be the focus of this course. For example, you could also use Flutter for building web apps that run in modern browsers, because these web apps use certain features that are not supported in older browsers. And you can also use Flutter to build desktop apps for Windows, macOS, and Linux. But again, the focus of this course will be on mobile apps. If you're primarily interested in one of these other platforms, this course won't be the right course for you. Now, what's really important to understand and know regarding these target platforms is that you can, of course, write the code for all platforms, no matter on which machine you are, because it's one shared code base, it's one code for all these platforms. But when it comes to then actually producing these translated code packages for the different target platforms, you have some restrictions. Most importantly, you can only test and run iOS and macOS apps on macOS machines, Windows apps on Windows machines, and Linux apps on Linux machines. So if you want to build an iOS app on Windows, you can write the code for it, because the code is the same. That's one of the main selling points of Flutter, as you learned, but you can't actually generate the app itself that would then be uploaded to the app stores. For that, you need a macOS device. Of course, you can nonetheless write all the code and then just copy that code to a macOS device, to a MacBook, for example, once you're ready to build it for the App Store. But it's worth knowing that on a Windows machine, you can't build those iOS or macOS apps. That's important to know and understand. For Android and web apps, you have no restrictions. No matter if you're on a macOS, Windows, or Linux machine, you can not just write the code, but you can actually also generate the Android or web apps themselves based off that one code base on all these platforms. So now that you know what Flutter is and what you can do with it, it's time to get started with it. And for that, you need to install a couple of tools. In this video here, I'll give you the high-level overview. In the next video, I will walk you through all the setup steps needed on Windows machines. In the video thereafter, I'll cover macOS, and of course, you can skip the lecture that you don't need. If you're on a macOS device, you can skip the Windows lecture and vice versa. Here in this lecture, as mentioned, you get the big picture, and then after those next lectures, where I show you the exact steps, we'll get started creating a new Flutter project and previewing our first Flutter app. So therefore, in order to get there, let's start diving into those general setup steps. And here, the first step, as you will see in those next lectures, is always to download and install the Flutter SDK, the Flutter Software Development Kit. And that includes Flutter itself, so this SDK itself, so this collection of tools and this Flutter framework, which I mentioned earlier. But it also means that you will need to install Git, which is a version control software that is generally totally independent from Flutter. It's a software you can use in general as a developer to, for example, create code snapshots to which you can go back if you mess something up in your code, for example. But Flutter, these Flutter tools which you also install, actually use this Git software internally, which is why you will need to install that. Again, I will show you the concrete steps and will show you how to install Git in those next lectures. I'm just mentioning it here already. Now with that, you would have Flutter installed, and that would be enough to write the code. But in order to also build the app for different platforms, and in order to preview the app whilst you're working on it, you also need to install some platform-specific tools. For example, as you will also see in those next lectures, you will need to install Android Studio to build and test Android apps. And you will need to install Xcode for macOS to build and test iOS apps. As mentioned before, for iOS apps, you will not be able to install Xcode on Windows and Linux. You will need a macOS device for that. And that's why I mentioned that you can only preview and really build those iOS apps if you are on a Mac. The code is the same, but these tools can only be installed there. For Android apps, you don't have these restrictions. There you can install and configure Android Studio no matter on which machine you are. Now, once you have these platform tools installed, there's just one last missing step, and that would be to set up some virtual devices, some emulators on your system. For example, an Android emulator to preview your Flutter project as an Android app, running locally on a virtual device on your machine. For iOS, you would create an iOS simulator, and I will also show you how to do that in those next lectures. Using such virtual devices instead of your real phone is very useful, because that means that you don't have to use your real phone for testing, and that you instead can use this virtual device, which can also easily be erased if you need to, and which is a great tool for testing your Flutter project as you're working on the code. That's the theory. In the next lecture, we'll take a look at the Windows setup, and thereafter we'll take a look at the macOS setup, before we then thereafter take a look at how to create projects with Flutter and how to work with those projects. In this lecture, we're going to install Flutter and all other extra tools that are required in order to build mobile apps with Flutter on Windows. If you're not on a Windows device, you can skip this lecture. macOS is covered in the next lecture. So now to install Flutter on Windows, you should visit flutter.dev, the official Flutter website, and there click on Get Started. This takes you to the official Flutter documentation and there to the setup page. And there you can pick the operating system on which you are to find detailed instructions that tell you what to install on your system in order to use Flutter on it. Now here, since this lecture is about the setup on Windows, we are of course going to take Windows as an option, but it's important to understand that on this page you're not picking the platform for which you want to develop, but the platform on which you develop. So here you don't pick macOS just because you want to build a macOS app with Flutter, but instead you pick Windows because you are on a Windows system and you want to use Flutter on that. Then on this next page, you find detailed setup instructions, and I strongly recommend going through these instructions in addition to this video, since these instructions will always be 100% up to date. Sometimes some extra steps can be added, so you should always check out this page in addition to the video. And on this page, you also get direct links to all the tools you need to download, so therefore this is definitely a must-visit page. Now, when installing Flutter for Windows, there are some prerequisites. For example, you must install Git, as mentioned in the previous lecture. For that, you can simply follow this link on this page here, which takes you to the official Git website. And there, pick the Git version for your Windows system version and open that installer, which is downloaded here. This will now walk you through the Git installation process, and in general, you can accept all the defaults here and just walk through these different steps. But there's one setting you should override, and that is that you choose Use Git and optional Unix tools from command prompt if it's not the default for you already. You should select this option, as also explained in the official Flutter documentation. Now with that, you can continue through the remaining steps and confirm all the defaults there, no changes needed. And yes, there are quite a bit of steps, but once you're done, this will install this Git tool on your system, and installing this, as mentioned, is a prerequisite to then install and use Flutter. So once that's done, you can finish this step and go back to the official setup instructions. And now it's time to really install Flutter itself. For that, you should download that latest version using that link in the official documentation. And then, once this was downloaded, open this zip file that was fetched here and extract it. And in that file, you will find a Flutter folder. Now that Flutter folder must be moved somewhere else. And it's generally up to you where you want to move this, though the official documentation recommends picking a path like this. So here I'll go to my C drive, create a new folder there, which I will name src, and paste that Flutter folder from that zip file into this folder, so into this src folder, which again can take some time because it is rather big and there are a couple of files to be moved and copied. And once copying this extracted Flutter folder to this source folder here, in my case finished, you're ready to continue with the next steps. By the way, keep these warnings in mind when picking a location for your Flutter folder on your system. So to continue with the next steps, you must update your path, which in the end means you must make your operating system, or specifically the command prompt on Windows, aware of these extra Flutter tools which you did now install, because it turns out that this Flutter folder which you just copied contains a bunch of tools that will be needed later on. Now, to make your system aware of these extra tools, you should search for env in your system search to edit your system environment variables. Alternatively, you can manually go there through the control panel. So here on this page, you should edit your environment variables, and then there your user variables for your user. Now there you should typically already have a path variable, so a variable called path, but if you don't have it, simply create it. Now I do have it, so instead of creating it, I'll select it and click Edit. And here you now must add a new entry, a new value to that variable. And the value that should be added here should be the path to the bin folder in that Flutter folder you just copied around. So in my case, it's this path, or to be precise, this path, which then includes /bin at the end. So you should copy this path to this bin folder in that Flutter folder and insert this as a new value into this path environment variable. And then click OK and OK. Now with that done, you can continue further down to the next step and run Flutter Dart in your command prompt to verify that Flutter was installed correctly. So for this, open your default command prompt, which is pre-installed on your system, and in there, run Flutter Dart. Now, if you get an error that the Flutter command can't be found, you should revisit this step where the path was updated, because something went wrong there. It should find the Flutter command if you did update the path correctly. So make sure you did enter the right path in the right environment variable if this Flutter Dart command fails. Otherwise, this command should work and should give you some output that looks something like this. Now, you might still get some errors in there, and that's totally fine, but it should find the Flutter tool. on your system. It should generally work. Now, one of the errors we're getting here is that it can't find the Android toolchain. So the tools required to develop Android apps are not installed on this system yet. And that indeed is the case. We haven't done that yet. So that's indeed what we'll do next. Now that Flutter was installed and this Flutter command works, you should move on to the Android setup to prepare your system for Android app development with Flutter. And that all starts with downloading Android Studio, which is Google's official Android development environment, which includes a bunch of tools that will be used under the hood by Flutter. So on this page, you should download Android Studio, and for that, of course, accept all these license agreements and then start the download. And this is also a rather big file, so downloading this can take a couple of seconds or even minutes. And once the download finished, you should open this downloaded Android Studio installer. So with that installer started, you can and should accept all these default values, especially make sure that the Android virtual device will be installed so that you can start such a Android emulator later on. I do recommend that you keep the default installation location to ensure that everything works smoothly later on, and then continue with the remaining steps and finish that installation process. Again, this might take a couple of seconds or minutes, of course. Now, once this finished, you should also immediately start Android Studio, and this will open up a configuration wizard since you're starting this for the first time. Now, in that wizard, you should choose custom options here. Confirm the default location though. You can pick any color theme of your choice. We won't use Android Studio for writing code in this course anyways, so it doesn't matter too much. But you should make sure that you do check Android SDK here, that you do also pick an Android SDK platform here, and Android virtual device. Now in my case, I can't confirm the default folder which it would like to use for downloading and storing these SDK files, since I have a special character in my user folder path, and hence I'll pick a different path here. Which you of course might not need to do. And with that you can continue, accept these license agreements, and finish the setup process. So once done, you can finish this setup wizard, and a new window should open where you should select SDK Manager by clicking on More Actions, SDK Manager. And here you should for one make sure that you do check that latest stable Android version here under SDK Platforms. And under SDK Tools, you should select the SDK Build Tools, and make sure that you also got the SDK Platform Tools selected here. In addition, the Android SDK Command Line Tools should also be selected. And once you did all of that, you should press Apply to make sure that these extra tools will be installed. Again, you will need to confirm some license agreements and walk through these remaining installation steps, which again can take a couple of minutes. Once this is finished, you have all the software installed that must be installed in order to build Android apps with Flutter. But now you should again go to More Actions here and go to Virtual Device Manager. And here click on Create Device. This wizard allows you to create a new virtual device blueprint, and the idea behind virtual devices simply is that you have an Android device emulator running on your system to conveniently preview your Flutter app whilst you're working on the code. So here you can pick any template of your choice, like Pixel 6 in my case, click Next, download the latest Android version here, which again can take a short while. And then once that was done, finish this, click Next again, and on this page under Emulated Performance, pick Hardware if possible. And then click Finish. With that, you got a virtual device blueprint, and you can now start the actual emulator by clicking on this play button here. And this will start the emulator on your system, and you can restart this whenever you want to have such an emulator up and running again. You can close it when you're done for the day, when you're done writing your Flutter code, and you can restart it through that virtual device manager whenever you need that virtual device again. Though I will also soon show you an alternative, even more convenient way of starting that emulator. But you always must create such a blueprint, which we did do now. And with that, we finished all these setup steps. You can also run your Flutter apps on a real device, but I will come back to this part here later in the course. For the moment, we just need this emulator, which we did now set up as described here in the official docs. And with that, you got everything you need to build mobile apps with Flutter. As mentioned multiple times, we can't build iOS apps on Windows, which is why we won't add any setup for that here, but we got everything we need to build Android apps. Now, what's really important, if you get stuck at any point or if you're facing any problems, use that official documentation. And of course, you don't need to go through all these steps again and again every time you dive back into development. You only need to do this once. From now on, you can create new Flutter projects and work on these projects without going through all these steps again and again. So now that you learned how to set up Flutter and the Android development environment on Windows in the previous lecture, you're going to learn how to set up Flutter and Android and also the iOS development environment on macOS in this lecture. Of course, you can skip this lecture if you're working on Windows. Now, to set up Flutter and all the required tools on macOS, I recommend visiting flutter.dev, and there you can click on Get Started to be taken to the official documentation and there to the setup instructions. Here on this installation starting page, to which you also find a link attached to this lecture, you can choose your operating system, so not the system you want to target, but the system you're on. And here we'll therefore choose macOS. And once you clicked on that, you will find detailed setup instructions. And in general, I recommend going through these instructions in addition to this video. Because sometimes some tiny steps change, some links might change, and that's another advantage. On this page, you get direct links to all the tools and all the software that must be installed, and therefore you should definitely also check out these written official instructions in addition to this video. Now, for macOS development on this page, you learn that as a prerequisite, you need to have Git installed. I did mention this in an earlier video already. And indeed, Git will be installed for you automatically when you install Xcode. You might also already have it on your system by default, and therefore typically you don't need to install it separately, since we will install Xcode anyways, as we need that to build iOS apps. But you can also install Git separately if you want to. Also important, at least at the point of time I am recording this video, you have a separate setup step that's needed if you are on an Apple Silicon device, so a M1 or M2 or whatever macOS device. And of course, it's possible that in the future this step is not required, which is why you should also check out these written instructions in addition to this video. So here I'll just copy this code here, this command. And then you can open your default system terminal and execute that command in there. You might be prompted to enter your password, and once you did that, this should install some extra tooling or walk through that extra setup step, which is required if you are on such an Apple Silicon device. With that out of the way, you can move on to installing the Flutter SDK, so the Flutter tooling and framework itself. And you should, of course, pick the appropriate version for the macOS device you're on. Here, since I'm on an M1 device, I'll pick this Apple Silicon version and download this zip file. This zip file then will include all these Flutter tools and the Flutter framework. Now I'll wait for this download to finish. And once the download finished, you can unzip that downloaded package. And then with that unzipped folder here, just go anywhere on your system. Here, for example, I'm in my root user folder and created a tools folder there, though that name is absolutely up to you. It doesn't have to be named tools. But in there, I'll create a Flutter folder, and this name is also up to you and doesn't have to be Flutter, but I'll move all the content, all the files that were in that zip package into this Flutter folder here. Again, the exact path and the names of these folders are up to you, but you should store all these Flutter files and all these Flutter tools here in one central place on your system. And once you did that, you must add Flutter to your path, as it's called. You must make your operating system, macOS, aware of these Flutter tools which you just installed. You can run this command here in your terminal to make that terminal temporarily aware of your installation and make sure that this really points to that path where you just moved all these files. But you would have to rerun this command whenever you restart your system terminal. Since this is annoying, you can click on Update Your Path here, or choose this here on the right, and instead update your path permanently to make your system and your terminal permanently aware of these Flutter tools you installed. Now on this page here, you find detailed instructions on how to do that. In the end, you first of all want to find out which kind of shell you're using, for which you can run echo shell, and this should either point you at CSH or bash. If you're seeing bash, you should update a .bash profile or .bashrc file in your root user folder. If it's set shell, as I have it here, you should update a .cshrc file. If you don't have these files, you can simply create them. Here in my case, in my user folder, where those dot files should be located, I have such a .cshrc file, and I am using this C shell, so that's therefore the file I should update. And you can do this with a regular text editor. Again, if you don't find that file, you can simply create it, though it might also just be hidden, and therefore you should make sure that you do show hidden files in your Finder. If you then still don't find it, you can create it. Here, as mentioned, I do have it, and I'll edit it with the default text edit app. And in that file, you then should insert a new entry, which is also mentioned here in the official docs, and that should be this entry here. So here I'll just copy that, and then insert it here at the end of this file. And now this entry also must be adjusted, because here you should point to that folder where you dragged your Flutter files into. So in my case, tools, Flutter, and then there, this bin folder. Now we already see /bin here at the end, so I just need to replace this path here, this part between the square brackets and the square brackets themselves, with a path to this Flutter folder. Now one of the easiest ways of getting this path is to right-click on that Flutter folder here, and then choose Get Info, and then here copy this where part, paste this in here, and then also add /Flutter since that name itself wasn't included, so that overall it should point at your users folder, then at the path where you stored these Flutter files, and then there this /bin folder. Thereafter, you can and you should save this file, and once you did that, you should close and reopen your terminal app. And then in here, if you run which Flutter, you should see that path to that Flutter tooling as an output. You should not get an error that this is an unknown command or anything like that. If you do get an error that this is an unknown command or anything like that, check that path which you added to this .configuration file a couple of seconds ago. And with that, you got Flutter installed. You should now be able to also run Flutter Doctor, which is a command you can run to find out whether everything is prepared for Flutter development on your system. And this should now not give you an error that this command is not found. Instead, this should now do some initial setup work, possibly download some extra packages when you run this the first time, and then thereafter it should show you some output where some steps might still be missing. For example, here I got no Android toolchain set up because I haven't added all these Android tools yet, but Flutter is installed, and in my case I also got Xcode already installed, though I will still show you how to do that later in this video. So you should get some output here, and with that out of the way, we can skip this GitHub step here and instead continue with the platform setup for the platforms we want to cover. Now here I'll show you both iOS and Android setup. You can of course also skip one of the two if you only want to target one specific platform. But here I'll show you both, and I'll start with iOS and Xcode. Now for that you need to download and install the latest version of Xcode. And the easiest way of doing that is to use the Mac App Store. There, if you don't have it installed yet, you should be able to download and install Xcode, which can take a while because it is a quite big tool, as you can tell. So you should walk through that. And once you got Xcode installed, you must run these two commands in your terminal to basically allow Flutter to work with Xcode behind the scenes. So for that, paste them into your macOS terminal. You again might be prompted to enter your password, and that's it. You might not even get a response or some output here, but you also shouldn't get an error. Thereafter, also run this command here to accept all Xcode license agreements. And here you can simply press space to move to the end of this agreement. And once you're there, which can take some time, you should type agree in here and hit enter. And that's all you need to do for Xcode. Of course, I also recommend setting up an iOS simulator so that you can also preview your Flutter project on an iOS device as you're working on the code. For that, you can run this command in your terminal now that Xcode is installed, like this. And this should now create and boot a new iOS simulator, a virtual iOS device, a virtual iPhone, if you want to call it like this, on your system. And whilst we're not using it just yet, we will use simulators, virtual devices like this throughout this course to preview our Flutter apps as we're working on them. Now we're going to skip this step where we create and run a simple Flutter app for now, because we're going to do that in the next lecture. And here I'll also skip the step where we run this app on a real iOS device, which you also can do, because I'll cover this a little bit later in the course. For the moment, for the next course section even, we'll just use this simulator. And therefore here we can instead move on to this Android setup part and quit that iOS simulator because we don't need it right now. Now, if you want to build Android apps on macOS, you also must install all the tools required for that. And most importantly, that's Android Studio, basically the Android equivalent to Xcode. For that, you can follow this link to be taken to the official Android Studio website and download that latest version of Android Studio from that website. Again, make sure you pick the appropriate version for the Apple chip you're on. Now, this is also a rather big file, a rather big tool, so this download can take some while. So here I'll quickly wait for this download to finish before I then finish this Android setup together with you. So now here the download finished for me, and you can therefore open that downloaded file and finish the installation by dragging Android Studio into your applications folder. Now copying that will again take a couple of seconds, as it's a rather big file. And once that's done, you should open Android Studio and walk through this setup wizard. Now here in this wizard, you want to make sure that you install the Android SDK, and here also such an Android API. And you can keep that default path which it suggests here. Click Next. And then make sure you accept all these license agreements and click Finish. Now this will download a couple of packages and tools that are required behind the scenes, under the hood, to build Android apps. And again, this can take a couple of seconds or even minutes to finish. And once this finished, in this window which opens here, you should click on More Actions and go to the SDK Manager. And here in this window, we have to install some additional software. Here in this SDK Platforms window, you should install the latest Android version at the point of time you're watching this by simply clicking on this, by checking this. Under SDK tools, you should install these build tools here, and also the Android SDK command line tools. You should make sure that the Android emulator is installed, and these SDK platform tools, and then click OK and confirm this. And this will now again prompt you to accept some license agreements, and it will then download and install some extra software that's also needed by Flutter under the hood. Now, once that's all done, you can confirm this. And thereafter, you should run Flutter Dart again to confirm that Flutter has everything it needs for Android development, so that it finds all these tools that you just installed. For that, in your terminal, run Flutter Dart. And now at this point, this should give you some green check marks for Xcode and Android. And if it does not, as it does for me here, it might even show you what you have to do. For example, here I need to run Flutter Dart --Android licenses to accept some additional license agreements. So I'll quickly copy this, and for me it actually messed up the formatting here, so I'll fix this to make sure this is in one line, and confirm this with Y, and accept these licenses by typing Y for each of them. And with that, if you run Flutter Dart again, you should now also have a green check mark for Android toolchain, and if you installed Xcode before, also for Xcode, and of course for Flutter itself. If you don't have that green check mark for Android, if Flutter somehow can't locate Android on your system, you should try running this command, which is also recommended in the official Flutter documentation. Well, and with that, the last step that I want to go through here is that I also want to set up an Android emulator so that we also got a virtual Android device for testing our Flutter projects. For this, you should first of all enable VM acceleration on your machine if available. If it's not available, that's also not the end of the world, but you should try to enable it if possible, following the instructions on this page, to which you're linked from the Flutter page. And with that, go back to Android Studio, and here under More Actions, open this Virtual Device Manager, and in there, click Create Device to create a new virtual device blueprint. Now here you can choose from a broad variety of templates, and I'll simply use a Pixel 6 here, though you can of course use any template of your choice, and click Next. Then select a fitting Android version. Here I'll simply pick the latest one at the point of time I'm recording this. And you might need to download this when going through this wizard for the first time, which is what I'm doing here. Again, as always, this might take some time since it again is a rather big file. And with that successfully downloaded, we can continue and mostly keep all the default settings, though here for emulated performance, you should actually choose hardware GLES 2.0. Unless this causes any problems later on, in which case you can switch back to automatic. Here I'll choose that though, but keep all the other defaults, and then click Finish. And with that, you got that blueprint created. Now you can click this play button here to start this emulator based on that blueprint. And from now on, you can of course always restart that if you're diving back into Flutter development. You don't have to go through all that setup process over and over again. And you will get your Android emulator, which is now booting up here, which can then be used to preview your Flutter app on an Android device as an Android app. At the moment, we don't have a Flutter project yet, but that will of course soon change. And now we got all the prerequisites we need to create Flutter projects and to then run them as iOS or Android apps on their respective simulators. Now what's really important, if you get stuck at any point or if you're facing any problems, use that official documentation. And of course you don't need to go through all these steps again and again every time you dive back into development. You only need to do this once. From now on, you can create new Flutter projects and work on these projects without going through all these steps again and again. So now that we have Flutter and all the platform tooling set up, it's time to finally create a Flutter project and run a first Flutter app on a device. For that, you should create a new folder anywhere on your system. The exact path is up to you. For example, on the desktop, on both Windows and Mac OS, this is a fine folder. And there, create a new folder, for example, called Flutter Projects, written like this. Important, make sure that if you do choose a folder name that consists of multiple words, as I did here, that you use an underscore for separating these words, not a white space, not a dash, but an underscore. And once you created such a folder, you can use that folder to then create your Flutter projects inside of that folder. For that, you can simply open that folder in your terminal, in your command prompt on Windows, or in this case, PowerShell, which it opened for me here. On Mac OS, you simply open it in your default terminal, and then in your terminal or command prompt, navigate it into this Flutter projects folder. Both on Mac OS and Windows. You can create a new Flutter project by running flutter create and then choosing any name of your choice. For example, first_app. Again, if you do choose a name that consists of multiple words, don't use white spaces or dashes, instead use an underscore to separate words. And this command will now create a new project folder inside of that folder that you created, where a new Flutter app, a new Flutter project will be created in. So you got a new project folder with a new Flutter project inside of it. And the command is exactly the same no matter if you are on Mac OS or Windows. This will now create a new Flutter project folder, and it also shows you what you can do thereafter to run this Flutter app, but will not do this just yet. Instead, I first want to open this newly created project in a code editor, because of course building Flutter apps is all about writing code, and for that you do need such an editor. Now, whilst you could use Android Studio for writing your Flutter code, I personally recommend Visual Studio Code, which is an amazing and totally free, highly performant code editor, and which can be installed for all main operating systems. Mac OS, Windows, Linux. You can use it on all these operating systems. And if you visit code.visualstudio.com, it should automatically select the right version for your system here. Otherwise, you can click that arrow to pick the exact version you do want to install. This is the editor I will use throughout the course, and therefore, if you want to follow along as smoothly as possible, I recommend that you also install this editor. Now, installing it is straightforward. You simply download that installer here and walk through it. And once you installed VS Code, you can open it, and you should see a screen that looks something like this. Now, you can go through these walkthrough steps here to learn more about VS Code. Attached, you also find a short free video that gets you started with VS Code and its most important features. And you can customize its appearance just as needed, for example, by setting the color theme. Here I'm using Dark Plus, but you can of course use any theme you want. You can also go to View and hide and show various sidebars here. And once you're done, in the main sidebar, you should click Open Folder, and there select that first app folder, which you created a couple of seconds ago, and open it with VS Code. And this now opens this project in Visual Studio Code so that you can conveniently work with all the files and folders and all the code in this project. Now, as you see, this project actually comes with a lot of files and folders out of the box, but I will of course walk you through all the important folders and files in this course. Now, before we dive into any code or folders though, there's one extra configuration we should add to VS Code, one extra thing we should add to VS Code, and that would be a specific extension. Because besides many other amazing features, one very cool feature of VS Code is that you can add extensions to it. And there's one specific extension you should add by going to the extensions view, and that would be the Flutter extension, which is an official extension provided by the Flutter team, which helps with Flutter development and which is a must-have when using VS Code for Flutter development. Now, you should install that. It's totally free to use. And once you install that, you're ready to use VS Code for Flutter development. So now with VS Code being set up and this first Flutter project being created and opened in VS Code, Attached to this lecture, you find a main.dart file, and you should take that file and go to that lib folder in that Flutter project which you created and which you opened in VS Code, and replace the main.dart file you find in there with the one you find attached, simply to make sure that we all have the same starting state. Now, at the beginning of the next course section, I will walk you through these folders and files that were created here. And of course, in the next course section, you're also going to learn how to write Flutter and therefore also Dart code from the ground up. This main.dart file here, of course, already has some code in it, so that soon we can see something on the screen. At the moment, of course, all this code won't tell you much though. That's no problem though, you're going to learn all about this code and much more throughout this course. So now with that main.dart file being replaced, we can use this starting code, this demo code, which I provided to you here, to see a first app running on an emulator. And for that, you should make sure that you have a virtual device, an Android emulator or an iOS simulator up and running. And if that's not the case, a simple way of running such an emulator is to use VS Code, and then there under View, choose the command palette or use the shortcut which you see here, which will open this command window here where you can type commands and execute them from inside VS Code. And for example, if you type Flutter here, you'll see some Flutter related commands. You could, for example, also create a new Flutter project here with this tool if you wanted to. But if you then add a bit more context here, and you, for example, also start typing emulator, you should see this launch emulator option here. And if you choose that, a new window should open up that allows you to pick an emulator. And here I'll use that Android emulator, which I created before. And if you confirm this here, this emulator will be started for you. And that's simply a bit easier and more convenient than doing that through Android Studio. And you could, of course, also start an iOS simulator from in there. In this course, I will mostly use the Android emulator though, since that runs on all systems, whereas an iOS simulator can only be started on macOS, and since not all students have macOS, I will stick to Android for most examples. Now, with such a virtual device up and running, we can run our Flutter app on it. It's a simple app, but still, this code, which I provided to you, creates an entire Flutter app that can be executed on a mobile device. Now, to run this app on a mobile device, you got a couple of options. First of all, I recommend that you go to View, and then there under Appearance, you make sure that you show the status bar, which is this bar at the bottom. There you should see the device which will currently be used for running your Flutter app here. And if you click on this device, you could also change it and, for example, test it as a macOS or Windows app or anything like this. This course here is about building mobile apps with Flutter though, and therefore here I will always use such an Android emulator or the iOS equivalent. But here you can make sure that you will run the app on the correct device. And once you did make sure that the correct device was picked, you can run this app here by going to the main.dart file. And there you should see a couple of options above this main thing here. And here, for example, you also have a run option. And if you press this option here, the app would be built for the platform you chose here in the status bar. And it would be executed on that device which you selected in the status bar. Now, alternatively, you can also use the terminal, which you can also open through VS Code, and then there choose New Terminal, and there run Flutter Run. This would also run this app here on the device which is currently selected in the status bar. Now, the approach I will use in most cases is a different one though. In VS Code, with a Dart file selected, the main.dart file or later also another Dart file, you can go to the menu bar and there under Run, you find the Start Debugging and Run Without Debugging options. Now, I'll explain what the difference is later in the course. In most cases, in this course, I'll use this Run Without Debugging option, which will also build and run this Flutter app for the device that is selected in the status bar. So here, if you then press Run Without Debugging, you will see that a new process starts where this app is being prepared for being executed on that target device. This window here also opens up, this debug console, in which you could see error messages if something goes wrong. You can also close this window though, the build process will still continue. And this little menu here, this little item here, which also can be moved around, also opened up in the editor. This can be used to control the running app. You can, for example, stop it by pressing this stop button here. You can restart it to make sure that all the changes you might have made in code are picked up by using this button. In addition, this little window here at the bottom might have opened up, allowing you to start the Flutter DevTools, which I won't do here though, but about which you will learn later in the course. And now with that app up and running, if you do go back to your emulator, you should see an app that looks something like this running on that virtual device. Of course, a very simple, not too useful app, but a first Flutter app running on this virtual mobile device. And everything you see here on the screen is in the end defined in this main.dart file and is controlled by that main.dart file. Again, you will of course learn about all that code in that file throughout the course. This lecture here is only there to give you a first glimpse at this code you will learn about throughout this course, and of course to also show you how such a Flutter app can be run on such a virtual device. Now with that app up and running, let's also make our first little code change to see how that could be done and how those changes would be reflected on that virtual device. For that, back here in the main.dart file, if you scroll down, you should at some point find these text things here. These are so-called text widgets, but again, you will learn more about widgets and how to build user interfaces with code in Flutter throughout this course. Now in this text widget here, in this first one, you find this text here, Flutter the Complete Guide. And let's say we want to change this code and we want to rename this to Flutter the Complete Guide Course. We can simply make that change, and if you then save that code, and at the moment it's unsaved, as you can tell in VS Code by this dot here that's showing up next to the file name in this tab. But once you save that change, for example by pressing Ctrl S or Command S on macOS, you will see that we had these little windows open up at the bottom here, which in the end tell us that the Flutter extension that we installed here in VS Code noticed those changes and automatically updated the app running on the virtual device. So without us doing anything, you see that indeed there, the UI was updated and this change can be seen there. Now sometimes it happens that changes you make are not picked up, and in that case, you can press this flash icon here to force Flutter to take another look at your code and apply these changes, or to use this restart icon and basically restart the app, which will always ensure that all your saved changes are reflected there. And these features simply exist to make the overall Flutter app development process as convenient as possible, since you don't have to restart the entire emulator or wait for the app to be rebuilt every time you make a tiny change. Instead, as you saw, when you make a change, it's typically reflected in the running app instantly, which of course is great and allows you to develop in a very fast pace. So now that we started this app in the last lecture, and we also had a first glimpse at some Flutter and Dart code, I want to come back to one thing you can see in that code. And that's this material app thing here. This thing here is a so-called widget, as I mentioned in the last lecture, but you will learn more about widgets and what widgets are all about later in this course, in the next section to be precise. But one thing that's noteworthy about this material app widget here is its name, material app. And it's noteworthy because it includes a very important word, material. Because Flutter apps by default use material design, which is Google's flexible design system. Now you can learn more about material design on material.io, which is the official webpage of the material design system and language. And in the end, this material design thing is simply a set of suggestions, rules, and guidelines established by Google that help you build beautiful user interfaces. And Flutter embraces material design, and by using this material app widget here, which we will use throughout this entire course, you get a lot of base styles and rules that ensure that your mobile user interfaces that are built with Flutter will always look nice. And of course, that's just a basic app here. Throughout the course, we will build way more fancy and advanced apps, of course. Now, what's really important to understand about material design is that even though it is a system built by Google, it does offer you a lot of customization options and it's highly extendable. So as you will also see throughout the course, it's not the case that all your apps will look the same. You can customize everything and you will learn how you can style the apps to look exactly the way you want them to look. So it's not a prison, but instead this material design thing here is really all about giving you a foundation on which you can build up on. So you will see this material app throughout the entire course, and in the end this material app thing will be the reason for a lot of base styles you get in your app and will be the foundation on which we build up on as we apply our own stylings throughout this course. And now with all of that out of the way, with this first glimpse at the code here out of the way, it's now really time to get started and dive into Flutter and Dart. And therefore I want to conclude this section here by giving you a brief overview of what you can expect from this course and how you can get the most out of this course. And in the end, this course is structured like a pyramid. We start with the important Dart and Flutter fundamentals, with the core features and the base syntax and all the core concepts you need to build mobile apps with Flutter and Dart. Of course, we're not going to stop there though. Instead, we're then also going to dive into advanced features after covering the core features in the first couple of course sections, and you will learn how to handle user interaction, how to customize the styling of your apps, how to build multi-screen apps, and much more before we then dive into even more advanced features and you learn how you can animate apps, how you can connect a backend, how you can use native device features like a camera in your Flutter app, and much more. Now, what's really important to understand is that we really do start at the basics though. You don't need any prior Flutter or Dart knowledge, you don't even need any programming experience, and instead starting with the next section, you will learn about all these basics step by step, slowly building up on each other so that by the end of the course, you will be able to build your own Flutter apps, no matter if they're super simple or slightly more advanced. Now, of course, I also want to ensure that you get the most out of this course though. And of course, that's a video on demand course, so it all starts with watching those videos, but definitely do it at your pace. Use the video player controls to slow me down if I'm going too fast or speed me up if I'm going too slow for you. Feel free to skip lectures if you already have some Dart or Flutter experience. Really take advantage of this on-demand nature of this course. This of course also means that you can and should repeat videos or entire sections as needed. If a certain concept isn't entirely clear the first time, definitely feel free to watch a video again. It's an on-demand course. Take advantage of it. But don't just use the videos. Instead, I do recommend that you also do code along and that you practice what you learned. Now for that, I will sometimes prompt you to try something on your own, but definitely also do it when I'm not telling you to practice. Instead, feel free to pause those videos when we're about to add a new feature and try adding it on your own. Also use what you learned and build your own demo projects outside of this course. This course gives you the foundation. You need to use it on your own in your own projects, because ultimately that's how you become really good in something, and Flutter is no exception. But if you're following along with this course, also use the code attachments, the code snapshots I'm providing to you, as part of the next course lecture, so the lecture after this one, to compare your code to mine. Because if you fail to replicate what I'm showing in the videos, or if you're facing some error that's not occurring in the videos, you can use these code snapshots to compare your code to mine and find and fix this error. That's why I'm providing them to you, so definitely take a look at that next lecture and use those code snapshots as you practice what you learned. You will also find a link to all the course slides in that next lecture. Last but not least, also help each other. This is an online course, but there is a community behind it. There is the Q&A section, which you can use to ask if you're getting stuck and you're not able to continue on your own. But don't just ask there, also help others, help each other, and also answer in that Q&A section. Because ultimately, if you answer a question by some other student, you're forced to think about the problem and you're forced to come up with a solution. And this is a great practice opportunity. In addition, this course also gives you access to a Discord community, which you can join for free if you want to find more amazing developers there so that you don't have to learn Flutter on your own.